I'm here today at the Johnny Rock Stadium to present to you my multimedia feature on LGBTQ inclusivity in football. Now, I'm delighted to say I was able to exclusively speak with John Holmes on everything LGBTQ inclusivity within the game. Now, you may know John from somewhere because he's the head of Sports Media LGBT's website. He also writes for Sky Sports and is a content editor. So I thought it'd be great to get him on my project to talk about everything to do with LGBTQ inclusivity and representation within the game. First up, we talk about LGBTQ fan groups and the importance of them to football.
Imagine a world where we didn't have the likes of Villa and Proud and Chelsea Pride and all the other fan groups out there. How far would that set us back as an LGBTQ community if these fan groups didn't exist?
I suppose if they didn't exist, then we'd be living in a world where people have these people that say, why do you have to drag this into football? It doesn't matter, and I don't care, and all the rest of it. We'd be living in a world where these people had won, and football was only ever talked about at one level, like what's happening in the game, a tactical view or everything to do with statistics of the match, and everything peripheral to that for us as humans and part of society, and the social factors that influence the game would not be discussed at all. So we'd also wouldn't be talking about issues like racism and sexism and everything else that forms part of our human interaction. So I think we'd live in a very bland kind of anodyne world, and it's just not realistic because all of us are kind of affected by social change and social justice. We need to find community. We need to kind of find those people who we can relate to as well. And as we've seen this year more than ever, the movement to try to drive for equality, is absolutely pivotal to people's lives, and football is no different. It's a mirror to society. And is also an incredibly powerful force, to unite communities. So, if we didn't have these groups, then we would be living in a very kind of monochrome world, I think.
Yeah, that'd be weird. That'd be really weird because I think it'd put me off like really investing in football if I'm like there's no sort of groups out there that I could sort of relate to in terms of people like myself, especially with like not just with football groups, but just with having role models and having these sort of like what you look up to. I think it's important in terms of.
It's essentially it's the Section 28 model, and you'd be putting that on football. It would be like you're not allowed to promote this, so we're not allowing you to talk about it. That would be the atmosphere, and of course, as we know, that just festers kind of ill feeling and discontent because you're asking people to suppress a natural part of who they are.
So we've already spoken about LGBTQ fan groups, but how about LGBTQ all-inclusive football clubs? Well, here's Holmes speaking about the importance of these football clubs to the game.
Moving on a bit now to some different topic. So I spoke to someone from Soho FC recently, and they said to me that you have close relations to many LGBTQ inclusive football clubs around the country. With that in mind, how important are these LGBTQ football clubs in terms of bringing people closer to the game who might have lost interest in the past?
Yeah, I think they're hugely important. I think I did a piece actually yesterday with on rugby, and we were looking back at one of the kind of Rainbow Laces moments from previous years. And Ben Cohen sort of said it really well. It's important to recognise that these aren't kind of gay clubs. They aren't gay sports clubs. They're LGBT inclusive, and they mean that anyone can come and play there and find an inclusive environment. That's the whole point of it. So you can be straight and come and play at somewhere like Charlton Invicta or Soho FC, and you absolutely, find that is a football space where everyone is welcome, and that is the point behind it. And I think every club should hope that it is LGBT inclusive. It's not a thing that's special to these clubs. It's just that the formation of them was designed so that people from the community can go there in the knowledge that there won't be any any issues kind of relating to that part of who they are, and that they can enjoy the game and find friendships and make kind of build up their self-confidence or whatever it is that they want to achieve by being part of that community. That is the aim of it. I think that's also a really important part of these clubs is the social element. And they're places where you can kind of make friends. And that was the other part of the rugby piece I did, talking to one of the Bison's players in Bristol. He said like he came out after he left school and he'd gone to uni, came out in his mid-20s, and just kind of he didn't know any gay people. He didn't have any gay friends, because he'd never really he'd always struggled with that part of who he was. And he wanted to kind of connect with the community, but sport was his thing. That was what he wanted to use to build up his own self-confidence. So obviously he went to his local LGBT inclusive sports club and made a whole host of friends that have lasted, for years and years. And that's tremendous. And that's what sport is about. It's about finding community. So I will always kind of advocate for these clubs, but I will also always stress that, you can be straight and you can go and play in these places and you will be absolutely embraced and welcomed.
Yeah, obviously there are, like you said, there are clubs like Charlton Invicta and newly found Millwall Romans, who are actually officially affiliated with Millwall and Charlton, who are big EFL clubs. How big of a message is that sending out to everyone that like clubs are officially affiliated with these LGBTQ plus inclusive football teams? Is that showing to everyone, including people who aren't in favour of these teams, the homophobes out there, that no matter what, we are standing by our LGBTQ plus community?
Well, I think the most important thing, like Charlton were the first, back in 2017, and now we've seen quite a few of these kind of partnerships evolve. So there's Bristol City and Bristol City Panthers, and also the Newcastle Panthers as well. So and usually it's kind of the charity foundation arm of the club. So the trust, has a responsibility for kind of community outreach. And if you're in a community where you have obviously a lot of LGBT people, in your local area, and they do in Millwall and Charlton, kind of all these areas like Greenwich and Bexley and what have you. I think there's Lambeth, a high proportion of LGBT residents. Bristol would be the same. It's absolutely fantastic because they're recognizing that they need to service the people within their community and connect to them to football if they haven't been that well connected before. So actually, I'm kind of surprised, really. I suppose we've seen the rise of LGBT clubs in a lot of the big urban areas. So you've got like Mersey Marauders and Manchester Village and all these kind of Village Manchester FC and all these kind of clubs. But I think there is definitely more potential for the clubs, the big clubs in those urban areas, to be reaching out to their local LGBT club and saying more like, how can we work with you? How can we support you? Because ultimately the connection between the two should be a really organic one. Yeah. And both should profit off it. Maybe not in a financial way, but certainly in a holistic way. So that is I think it's a no-brainer. I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't happened more already. But the fact that the Romans, have now moved to Millwall to be part of the Millwall family is just a sign of how important this is, and I think we'll see more of it.
Yeah, as I say, like other teams like Leicester Wildcats, you're surprised like Leicester City haven't affiliated with the Leicester Wildcats, because they can bring extra ideas for Rainbow Laces and that lot. And like you said, it's not about profiting, but it's about expanding like your networks and being able to find more creativity. And if you affiliate with those sort of teams, they can offer you something different. They can offer you the extra ideas and extra output, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and who's to say, like you and I don't know whether those conversations have been had, and maybe they have been talking for a while, and something is in the offing. But for any club, that's always the potential. But quite often it just takes kind of one or two individuals to kind of make these things happen. And I think maybe there's still a kind of perception of like, oh, they wouldn't be interested in us, and maybe I won't ask. And these things just kind of persist for a long period of time. But it only really takes couple of people who are committed on both sides of the equation to kind of make these things happen. So hopefully more of those people will meet and connect, and we'll get these partnerships together, because I think the Bristol one in particular, I can see how that's blossomed between Bristol City and the Panthers. I think is a great example of kind of collaboration there.
Yeah, definitely, and hopefully we can only hope for more clubs definitely affiliating with their LGBTQ plus inclusive football teams. But obviously, not all areas of the country do have these LGBTQ plus inclusive football teams. I mean, the area that I'm in, Cheltenham, don't have one. Back home in Reading, there's also not an LGBTQ plus inclusive football club. Do you think we're going to get to a stage soon in the future where all places will have an LGBTQ plus inclusive football club? Because from my perspective, I'm missing out. Like I'd love to join one, but I'm not in the area to at the moment, which is really annoying. I'm not in where the locations are for these.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think we'll see like every kind of club or have one. I mean, obviously, I hope that we see more, but I think, maybe in places where you are in the world, and Reading as well. I know, for example, like the Berkshire Unicorns are part of Maidenhead Rugby Club, so that's an example that's happened there. And of course, you're nearer kind of like that West Country area where you've got the Bisons, and I think maybe like, is it Wessex Wyverns in rugby as well? So
yes.
So there are other kind of LGBT inclusive sports clubs that are kind of like not too far away, but it will take somebody who is LGBT, who's passionate about football, and it could be yourself. To get but it takes a lot of effort to get these things off the ground. You've got to kind of put out the feelers to find out who else is keen. Obviously, if there's just like 5 of you, that's not enough to kind of to get something like that moving. You might be able to get kind of a 5-a-side team together, but it takes a hell of a lot of effort to get these things off the ground. And I guess maybe there's probably been lots of kind of thwarted attempts to do these kind of clubs in different parts of the world, and it hasn't quite happened yet. So I guess as more people become confident and are looking to access inclusive sport, then I guess we'll see more of it. But also, as more kind of everyday clubs say they're LGBT inclusive and are able to demonstrate that, then people will find their community there instead, and they won't need a specific LGBT club, perhaps. There's 2 different paths really. But the more, I mean, essentially it all leads to the same area. It gets people more active and included, and they're able to, to reconnect to the sports that maybe they've fallen away from before.
It's safe to say the women's game outshines the men's game in all aspects when it comes to LGBTQ plus representation and inclusivity at all levels. But why is this the case?
Obviously, during Rainbow Laces, the women's football gets looked up upon with like great sort of great coverage because of the stories they have, a lot of the players. Obviously, women's football is leading the way for LGBTQ plus inclusivity at all levels, quite clearly, whether that's within the players or fans. Obviously, the men's game is still quite far behind. What lessons do you think the men's game can learn from the women's game in terms of how the LGBTQ plus communities just embrace at all levels?
This question is kind of, I guess, is often asked. I don't think there's like one specific thing that will suddenly kind of jump from the women's game into the men's game and make it a whole lot, kind of warmer and more welcoming. I guess that's unrealistic, but there's obviously issues still tied around like hyper masculinity in the men's game, and kind of the issues around not wanting to show any weakness or perceived weakness, and how it could affect not just kind of your image as a competitive player on the pitch, but also the fact that players are competing against each other within squads and teams in order to be selected. And then, of course, you've got elements of, not, wanting to kind of put across the best image that you are attractive to another club if they might want to sign you, and all the rest of it. So it's just it's just more about trying to break down all those stereotypes around masculinity. And obviously we're seeing much more positivity around talking about mental health and people being able to open up and be vulnerable, but not in a way that diminishes them as being masculine. That's the key to it. If a player comes on and talks about the fact they've had an alcohol addiction or a gambling addiction, or they've had depression, I don't, and I'm sure I hope I speak for most people, but I would not see that as being in any way less masculine about them. You know, I understand they're being vulnerable and they're showing weakness, but it doesn't reduce them as men, you know, and that essentially, we need people to understand that being gay doesn't reduce you as a man. Obviously, there are stereotypes associated with like old school images of gay men on TV and you know, from like the sitcoms in the 80s and all these kind of things that, you know, we laugh about now, but this was the language. This was the only way that people had a vision of what a gay man looked like. Now, of course, you know, society has moved on incredibly. But there's still this kind of warped idea of what femininity and masculinity looks like. So I think the rise of the women's game, if anything, you know, it should show us that, you know, all these kind of views about what men should do and what women should do and who they should love and all the rest of it are just ridiculously outdated now.
Yeah, and a lot of it, like you said, links to stereotypes, and a lot of stereotypes are in relation to like toxic masculinity within a lot of men in the UK, heterosexual men. That leads on nicely to my last question. Finally, what is the solution to reducing homophobia in football? Quite a general one.
The solution to reducing homophobia in football, I think it's an understanding. I mean, it's an understanding from kids, you know, at a very young age about the effects that language and terminology and behaviour can have on others. You know, I think there's quite often, you know, and studies have shown this, and I think there'll be some more studies coming out in the next week or so that kind of demonstrate this further that I've learned about. But people who kind of often use casually homophobic language don't realise that they are having a negative effect on others. And it's not just people who are gay, you know, in those spaces who are affected. It could be people who are straight as well, but who are perceived to be gay, perhaps because they are a bit more effeminate, or, you know, or their kind of behaviour is different in some other way. But, you know, the culture of the dressing room, the locker room, and the football stadium as such, you know, stuff that fans shout from the crowd.
Yeah.
You know, it all kind of plays into this kind of, again, it's like the stereotypes, it's kind of perceptions of what people should be like in that space, and the traditions and everything that British football culture is steeped in tradition. So it's being able to dismantle all of that and to finally kind of break through to people that, you know, if you're tossing around words like kind of pansy or puff or all these kind of things, and you're saying things, you know, just to get a joke out of people or to kind of make yourself look funny in the locker room. You know, actually, there's going to be somebody in that space who hears this and thinks, "Wow, is that what they really think of? You know, of me?" Or is, like, if they're using these words, what would they say if they knew that I was gay? You know, what would be their reaction now? And it just creates this whole like cloud of uncertainty in people's minds, and they, you know, they draw it deep within themselves, and of course it causes them, it really affects their mental well-being. So it's always education. That's always the bottom line. Homophobia will always exist. We won't eradicate it. You know, it's in the same way that we'll never eradicate racism, sadly, or sexism, or all of these kind of forms of discrimination. So, you know, that's not to say we shouldn't fight for every attempt to kind of reduce them, you know, and I think we are making strides, but it's more about understanding that, you know, every generation that comes along, we can do more to educate them around the effects of this type of language and behaviour.
Do you quickly, before we end this, do you think that we're too far in terms of fan culture? Fan culture has evolved over so many years that it's just irreversible to really like make everyone understand that like LGBT people are welcome in sport in all areas, especially football.
Like, again, I mean, you know, it's a global game. Like fan culture, you know, it's incredible now. You see when Liverpool like won the league, and that was like celebrated all around the world. You know, it's incredible. So we can talk about fan culture here in the UK, and how we're encouraged because we've got the rise of the fan groups. You know, the LGBT fan groups are doing amazing work within their own communities, but you know, we've barely scratched the surface of trying to kind of educate, you know, fans around the world in different parts of the world who love their clubs, even if they're not able to go to games because they live in Malaysia or Indonesia or somewhere, you know, the other side of the world, but they love their clubs. But sadly, you know, they all live, you know, in parts of the world where, as we said, there's LGBT rights are non-existent, perhaps.
Yeah.
So, you know, the impact, so fan culture can still reach these fans as well. And it's great to see kind of clubs, you know, Manchester United, Liverpool, you know, kind of embracing kind of the Rainbow Laces campaign or other kind of diversity initiatives, and, you know, and making sure that's communicated to everybody.
Yeah.
One of the saddest things I think that happened in the Rainbow Laces campaign last year or the year before, I think it probably happened both years actually, was kind of, you learn through doing this sometimes that, you know, there are parts of the world where they actually turn it off during Rainbow Laces week because they don't want
to view anything. You can't view any football matches.
Yeah, I mean, for example, like, you know, one of the big activations we had last year was at the Brighton v Wolves match when they had a big rainbow mosaic at the Amex, you know, sort of following on from Watford the year before.
Yeah.
And you had a pretty big visual sign supporting the campaign. And Brighton, one of their players, you know, Ali Reza Jahanbakhsh, she's an Iranian international. So it's, you know, he's obviously kind of the poster boy for like Iranian football, and, you know, plays in the Premier League and is therefore a big star back home. But then you learn that kind of for Rainbow Laces week, you know, the decision was made to kind of turn off the Premier League, and that's a decision taken by the state because they didn't want to have that visibility.
Wow.
So that's pretty broad. So what's fan culture got to do with that? I think it's just, you know, the more fans that you can educate here, you know, to talk positively about a campaign like Rainbow Laces or just inclusion in general, you know, that permeates throughout the rest of the fan base and will even reach places, as we say, where, you know, these sorts of things are not just frowned upon, but perhaps even illegal.
I'd like to thank the amazing John Holmes for speaking to me today on these important subject matters. It all perfectly links in with my features, which you can view down below. Thank you for watching this special multimedia feature video, and hopefully you've learned something new. And hopefully you can see that it's not all negative when it comes to the current state of LGBTQ+ inclusivity and representation in the game, like the stats portray. Thank you for watching. It's been Daniel Khan from the Johnny Rock Stadium in Cheltenham.